And what motivated you to write a book about the decline of Napoleon?
Well, the that's the third volume of a trilogy that's a biography. The whole thing's biography of Napoleon. And that was finishing it off, really. That was the last volume. But I've always been intrigued, and this book was a chance to really think about it in depth. Because I have a very tolerant publisher. Was it a chance to think about in depth what led to the downfall? How and why did the empire disintegrate? Because when I was quite young, when I was actually still just coming to the end of my school years, there's a big, huge, multi-volume book written in the late 18th century by an man called Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And I've always loved Gibbon. I always thought he was a great storyteller and a great historian, great mind. And I remember when I first picked up the first volume, I must have been about, 16, 17. I was astounded because Gibbon begins his account of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the reign of Augustus, when the empire is supposed to be almost at its height.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, this is a bit weird. I wasn't ready for this. I thought volume 1 was going to be about barbarians invading the empire. It's not. It's about the Romans invading the barbarians' territory. That doesn't make any sense. And so yet what leads to decline and fall and the whole thing, over goodness knows how many volumes, is Gibbon trying to work out, what happens and when. And he doesn't really get definitive about it. He goes in and out all the way, and what you get's a rich history. And that started me thinking when I started writing the book, but particularly when I got to volume 3, I was responsible for discussing the fall of the empire. How did we get here? When is the empire at its height? When does it start to decline? I mean, could they be the same thing? Maybe not. All the imponderables that can look so easy until you look more closely. And I thought, I've got to explore this. I've got to see why Napoleon is still such a very important person when you think about his legacy to Europe institutionally, which, we could talk about for quite a while if you like. On the one hand, you go, when you're sort of an outsider like me, you come from British Isles or whatever, and you come to the continent, you come to France, you come to Italy, you come to Germany, you come to the Netherlands or Belgium, even to countries that resisted Napoleon like Spain. And what you see are systems of government that are pretty much alike. Education, things like that, pretty much alike. And yet, this guy left his mark, a legal system, on the one hand. And yet, on the other, you look at that empire on the map, there's absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And France was never a major military power again. And you think, this is all very odd. So that's what I set off to think about.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like when people think about Napoleon, they only think about the conqueror, but they forget about him as a politician, him as a lawmaker, you could say, a designer of a country. They forget about that. But yeah, for this interview, the big question is how? Like, how is it possible to become one of the most, you could say, most powerful person in Europe and then lose it all? So I want to start off the first few questions to kind of get an idea about how powerful was Napoleon. So that's my first question. What made Napoleon's empire so powerful at its peak?
Yeah, I mean, now its peak. When would you define it? That itself is interesting. If you look at, I'll talk about this briefly now, and we can come back to it. If you look at the empire at its greatest territorial extent, at 1810, 1811, you look at this thing and it splurges everywhere. You gasp. I mean, the North Sea coast as far as Danzig is annexed to France. All of Italy's under French control. Even in the Balkans, Croatia, Slovenia, what's now your Dalmatia, that's French, run from Paris. And you think, gosh, but that is not, I don't think personally, that's not the height of the empire. That's a sign of weakness, not strength. To me, the height of the empire, to get back to your question, I would say it's about 1867. After he's between 1805 and 1807, when at one point or other he's defeated the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians, and come to an agreement on an uneasy one that doesn't work with the Russians. And there are even a lot of people at the time who felt that way. Because the barometer for me is often found in local history, in the local archives. And that's when you get a lot of people who were trying to stay out of, in places like Italy and Germany, and in the Low Countries, who were trying to stay out of politics, sit at home, sit it out. Not because they were pro or anti particularly, but because things can change. And it's about that time that they start crawling out and saying, okay, this guy's here to stay. Can we have a job? Can I have a job? Can my son have a job? Can my daughter have a place in one of your new lycée, one of your new gymnasium? And that sort of thing. And I think what made it strong were several things. First of all, the area that Napoleon solidly controls, either directly through annexation to France or through having friendly governments who work with him a long time, like in the small German states, can work one way or the other. They are the richest, most populous, most economically and socially advanced parts of Europe. Napoleon controls France itself. He controls the Low Countries indirectly, through his brother Louis being King of Holland. Belgium is part of France, has been since 1795. He controls the West Bank, the left bank of the Rhine, directly annexed to France, and the small German states, the Mittelstaaten, like Bavaria, Württemberg, the Middle States, Baden, all loyal French allies, cooperating with him, modeling their reforms on his. And Italy through a mixture again of annexation and through, what they call the sister kingdoms, the satellite kingdoms, like in Italy, the area around Milan, Bologna, eventually Venice. These places are the economic powerhouses of Europe at the time. Outside Britain, Amsterdam, Genoa, the big banking houses, Po Valley in northern Italy, the Rhine, the Ruhr, they are where industry is, such as it is. In those days, they are where the rich agricultural regions, all those things are under his control. He can marshal all those resources, human and material and financial, to himself. He's inherited the reforms of the revolution, which he has, in the period of peace between 1800 and 1805, he has perfected, if you like. He's honed and sharpened in terms of local government, which also means, of course, the collection of taxes and the regulation of the tax system, sorting out the currency, boring things that people forget, that kind of thing. The system of conscription, which we'll probably come back to when we talk, which is brutal, but incredibly efficient. And the creation of things like the gendarmerie, ruthless paramilitary police force dedicated to the countryside that restores order, often in very brutal fashion. But it does, so he's got all that going for him. And he's got the other thing that comes out of that is the Grande Armée. A quarter of a million men, pretty much, that he trained in the channel camps in the period sort of more or less after he comes to power, who were meant for the invasion of England, which of course never happened, because he has to turn them and use them in 1805 against the Russians and the Austrians. These guys are some of the best trained soldiers the world's ever seen. They come in as royal recruits, and they have that between 18 months and 2 years basic training in the camps. They're a formidable force, and they've shown it in the campaigns. And it says conscription helps top them up. All those things, I think, are the major things, tangible things. He's also won the loyalty of a lot of the property classes of Europe. Many of them approve of what he's done. But things like taxation sorted out so it's fair, sorted out the currency. He's managed the economy reasonably well from the point of view of keeping the big cities provisioned with food. He's been lucky with good harvests, but he's used that luck well. He's won the confidence and respect of the army, that no one ever has, because no one's ever been successful. And he's gathered around him, I think this is the intangible bit, but this is the art as opposed to the science. He's gathered around him a tremendous team of administrators, government, local government policy. He sticks by them and he lets them get on with their work. All those things make an incredibly powerful, functioning regime. And I think it hits its height about 1867. That's when he hits his absolute peak, before he gets dragged into Spain, before he's continental blockade. All that.
That's an interesting take. Normally, people always say that it's later, 1810, late 1811, but I can, now that you explained this, I do understand where you're coming from. How did Napoleon's leadership style contribute to his early successes?
Certainly in politics, he's a very shrewd operator. And it's not the side of him, I think, that gets talked about enough. He was a military commander of questionable ability when he takes power to the military themselves, the people who know. He done very well in northern Italy, but he himself always admitted he'd had a lot of luck in the first Italian campaign. He'd come up against some pretty inept commanders, as he did in the second. But he'd shown how he could exploit that luck. Militarily, he knew what he wanted from an army. He wanted self-contained units, the core system, which won't really emerge until the Channel comes, but he's moving that way. He needed troops under good commanders, rather like Nelson at sea. Good commanders who we could count on to take their own initiative. I think one of his great strengths was, both in civilian and military affairs, was to choose good subordinates. Be loyal to them and let them use their initiative. And that shows in most of his campaigns. He made a complete mess of the Egyptian campaign. Complete mess. And he had to play that down. He had to live it down sometime afterwards. So there was always, among his fellow officers and fellow generals, a big question mark over his abilities after that one. But in civilian life as well, and in high politics, again, he was very shrewd. The company he chose, the people he chose to trust, and the way that he could manage a committee. That's something people don't think about enough. Mm-hmm. When he becomes first consul, you're head of the French state, that this institution he created, as far as I know, out of the top of his head, the Council of State, which really runs the show. And he was brilliant at running it because he wasn't bossy. Surrounded himself with good people, knew how to run a meeting fairly, knew how to take advice, knew how to ask the right questions, knew how not to offend people. He got people around a table and working in a room together who couldn't be in the same province a few weeks before. And he makes that work for years. The way of working was to say, okay, we take a decision, we stick by it. No disagreements outside this room. You can say what you like in here. Whatever goes wrong, I carry the blame. Stick with the boss like that. The loyalty he inspired. And I think those were the cores of his success as a person, as a leader.
Because would you say that Napoleon was a micromanager?
This is a very interesting flaw in his character. It's a flaw, but it's an interesting one. When he's most out of his depth is when he thinks he can get in there and do it. Anything to do with the Navy, he thinks he knows about the Navy. They're the one bunch of people he won't leave alone. And he can sit there because he's got a mathematical mind and a geographical mind. He can look at a map and say, look, there are so many hectares in France growing so many trees. We can build so many ships. And so the boss, it's not that easy. There's wood and there's wood. No, there isn't. Don't get me. You go and build me a navy, boss. Everybody called him boss. Everybody called him chef. There's wood and there's wood, boss. That's what all wood floats, doesn't it? No, boss. But look, eventually he would see sense usually. But if the things he couldn't do, then he could get obsessive. Whereas the things he really knows about, no, I know what you can do with a cavalry division, what you can't. So you get on and do what you do.
If you study the beginning of Napoleon's reign, like the first couple 3 to 5 years, are there any moments where you see seeds are getting planted for his downfall?
I honestly think you'd have to look pretty hard to find them. Given the way it all falls, I think you would find two things. And it's easy to say with benefit of hindsight. Look, he and the English can't trust each other. He thinks even if when he makes peace with them in Amiens, he's the only French revolutionary leader to do so. And he's hailed for it. This is the guy who did it. He didn't really do it. It was Talleyrand and his brother Joseph who did it. He said, I'm staying at home because I'm staying in Paris. I'm not coming to the talks because I'll lose my temper with them. It was the right thing to do. Because he would write to them, he'd write Joseph these terrible letters saying, you go in there and you tell Annie the blah, 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 advice. I'm going to come and punch him in the nose and just tear this letter up. And Joseph filed it away. But, you can see it there in a sense that sooner or later, I'm going to have to fight the English. Again, we can't live in peace together. And I've got to try to get them, which is why he starts building that big army, even when he's at peace. There's going to be a war. It just doesn't come out the way he wants it to do. He thinks it will, just as well for him. You can see it a bit there. You can see it. I'm very controversial on this, we've warned. It is dealing with the church. Everybody hails the Concordat. That's a great thing, great peace. He comes out of those negotiations not trusting the Pope, and the Pope doesn't trust him. And they're no sooner is kind of peace declared and the Concordat worked out and everything's, the machinery, the facade is there working. Then he is, in the same breath, he's saying, okay, install clergy, get the church's apparatus up and running again. He's turning around and saying to Fouché, who's his minister of police, get your spies in those churches and watch them. This guy from this parish you've written to me about, watch him. He's trouble. I don't trust them. At the same time, Pope is saying to his people, this guy is trying to push the Concordat and its terms outside France into the Italian states that he controls. Well, he's breaking the rules. And he's breaking the rules in Germany too. And he's not going to listen, so we can't trust him. There are two seeds of real trouble for the future.
Before we get into the downfall of Napoleon, I still want to be a little positive. Is there a favorite moment of yours where you're this is a moment where Napoleon truly showed how much of a genius he was? Could be a moment that many people don't even know about.
I think, if you'll permit me, I think there are two. And they're not maybe the ones people would think of.
Okay, I'm listening.
I think it's the creation of the Civil Code, the French Civil Code, which is brought to fruition in 1804. And I think the stroke of genius isn't what he did, it's what he didn't do. Well, he did two things in the course of that were decisive. First of all, he says, right, he chooses a man, Cambersmers, who's up to then been a very underestimated legal mind. Says, okay, you help put together the academic team that is going to assemble this code. And we all know what we want the code to be. want it to be clear and concise, so and written in plain language, so that any ordinary French person can buy a copy of it and take it home and read it. And not only so that judges and lawyers can interpret what's in it, it's that a plaintiff comes into court and says, excuse me, the code says that. I don't need it that way. That's what I want. But the second thing he does, that's what he doesn't do. He chairs most of the meetings of the compilation of the code. About 70%, which is a lot for a busy man. And he doesn't interfere very much. He comes in and lays down the law. If he's asked for a layman's opinion, he gives a layman's opinion, and he also says, look, I'm, Joe Average here. But looking at it as, a non-lawyer, I'm telling you that I don't understand what you're on about. Look, the word from the street is that people aren't going to like this. So, to me, that was a stroke of genius and created his most lasting achievement. The Cuba was. The other one, at about the same time, in the same years, the early years of 1802, 1804, is the creation of the Grande Armée in the Channel camps. How you get so many young men, all young men, soldiers, even the veterans, cooped up in these military camps, such a miserable place as northeastern France, and stop and keep discipline. Stop them deserting, stop them trashing every town they're near, and mold them into soldiers. Most of these guys were unwilling conscripts who had to be dragged into the army by the gendarmerie and often offered armed resistance. At the end of that time, they're the most fanatically loyal army you've ever seen. And when he takes them on their first campaign, which is up the Rhine and then over under the Danube to fight the Austrians and the Russians in Austerlitz, very few desertions. Honestly, I was astounded when I first studied that campaign. That's a genius. The guy who did that was a genius.
Yeah, the more I study these great men, I see that all of them have mastered the art of speed, moving with speed, and always nearly scaring their opponents, how quick they are. You see it in Alexander, you see it in Napoleon. It's honestly great to see. Now let's get negative. Now let's get to the decline. I think a great place to start is the Russian campaign. And my first question for that would be, why was the Russian campaign in 1812 such a critical mistake for Napoleon?
Yeah, I honestly think that and I've drawn on an awful lot of scholars who know an awful lot more about it than me at first hand. Mm-hmm. It couldn't have been anything else but a mistake. And what really fascinated me when I was reading up about this to write my chapters on it was that he had plenty of advice from people he trusted and respected, telling him, look, boss, this is not a good idea. He didn't like yes men. I mean, he could take it. Three of the people he trusts most in the world trying to look, you're nuts. This is not a good idea. You shouldn't do this. And they each come out with a whole bunch of different reasons. He doesn't get angry with them. He doesn't throw them out. He doesn't start swearing at them and saying, you're a loser. You don't think. No, I take your point. I take your point. But I've got to do it because I don't have an alternative. I've got to do it. I think it was doomed because, well, first of all, it's Russia. Now, it's not like Hitler's invasion of Russia. Hitler advanced over a broad front. Napoleon said, no, we're going straight up the middle. We're not getting spread out. We're not falling for that. Charles XII of Sweden went that way. No, not fall for that one. Going straight up the middle. We're keeping the army as close together as we can. We're going to bring the Russians to one big engagement and lick them, which is always a strategy. And then After we trounce Alexander, then he'll see sense and he'll talk to me. It was only supposed to last 3 weeks. Where it was always going to go wrong was Alexander did this unwillingly, and he was very uncomfortable with this traditional Russian strategy. All right, we'll engage with him when we have to, but we're just going to keep, we're not going to let him get us. We're not going to let him get us. And there are times when sort of Alexander's saying, I'm not happy with this. The people in St. Petersburg are not happy with this. They think we're chickens. And the generals will say, let them think we're chickens. It's how you're going to do it, John. Further in, further in, further in. And they get away with it. And twice he catches them, and twice he defeats them, and then they pull back, and it goes on and on and on.
The Russian winter came early, right?
Winter came early. The retreat needn't have been the disaster it was. He was too long in Moscow. But the army had taken an awful beating when it got to Moscow. It really had. One of the losses had been, most of the horses were lost on the march in. Those things can't be repaired. But the army itself was better fed, better provisioned, trained. The wounded were pretty well cared for. It started off as an orderly retreat. But a couple of things go wrong. He makes a bad decision. He could have fallen back through the Ukraine, which had not been touched by war and had plenty of supplies. There was one fairly weak Russian army down there. But he's confronted by the Russians at a very, very small engagement, and he's convinced there's a big Russian army he's going to have to fight his way through. From that one small engagement, he gets it completely wrong, and we've got to go back the way we've come. Going back the way we've come, there's nothing to eat. That's compounded by winter coming early. Both those things could have been avoided in the work. He would have been limping back with a much smaller, battered army, but they would have been in better shape, and there were more of them. And if he hadn't made those two decisions. But the real thing was the advance. We were talking a minute ago about speed. And he's the one who encapsulates it when he's writing about military things, the war of movement. It was developed under the French Revolution. He developed it further. You live off the land, you move fast. You can't do that in Russia. So, all right, he knows that. You're not stupid. So we'll bring plenty of supplies with us. That slows the army down. He's got these huge wagons, big teams of horses and oxen. They get stuck in the mud. The roads are awful. He made some of the same mistakes that Putin made a couple of years ago. All the tanks in the world are just sent on you, not if they can't get through the roads. The horses go in at the wrong time of year. They run out of fodder because they haven't brought enough. They start eating green raw grass, which gives them all gastroenteritis, and they all die, or most of them die. You've got practically no cavalry by the time he gets to Borodino. It's not to do with the retreat. Not because they ate them, it's because they died on them. All those things are going very badly wrong. As I say, the Russians can just pull back. The Russians are also fighting on their own territory, and they're the one country that has as good and as efficient a system of mass conscription as Napoleon. And they have been getting ready for this since 1807. They've got huge depots deep in areas Napoleon can't reach, where they can get raw recruits in and keep training them. Got military hospitals back there that can get the wounded on their feet again. You can't compete with that in the end. It brings in a huge army, and that army, it's also, I think this is a major flaw, is not well commanded anymore. Too many of his A-team are gone. Massena is too ill to come. He has to stay home, and he's in disgrace anyway. He had a falling out in Spain. Land's dead. That really of the core men, he picks Murat, but he picks him out of position, you might say. Makes Murat a corps commander, whereas Murat purely cavalry, and he's put in charge of a whole corps. He puts Jerome in charge for a while of an army group that he just can't handle. He doesn't know what he's doing. Um, Davo is probably the best one. He leaves Soult in Spain to try and keep things under control there. He's really not got a lot of his A-team left. The guys he's got doing most of the commanding and fighting in Russia, guys like Ney, guys like Victor, Oudinot, they're good men, they're good fighters, they're good corps commanders, but only when they're under his eye. And they're not. They're operating in very vast distances where they have no maps. The whole thing's a recipe for disaster, and it was.
If there's one thing that Napoleon could do different to maybe avoid the disaster a little, what would it be?
Well, I'm going to say the obvious, but it's not as obvious as you think.
Don't go.
Not that he shouldn't have invaded. Because in 1810-11, I'm not sure how much Napoleon ever knew about this. In 1810-11, Alexander is actually plotting to invade Poland and Germany. Now, his military commanders are saying, again, boss, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think we can take him on his own ground and beat him. And I think they were right. And he approaches Poles, and he said, for a whole number of reasons. And he said, well, look, what I want is for you guys to organize a rising if you can. Doesn't have to be that massive if you can't do it, because we're right on your doorstep. We'll be in there. We'll do the real fighting, but we need you to kind of clear the way for us. We need to come through Poland and do fighting in Germany. And we're going to take him on in Germany. The Poles just they divide base broadly into two groups. One group says, you want us you want us to let you do all the fighting in Poland until you get into Germany? Oh, well, yeah. Well, I don't think so. We've been fought over quite enough, thanks. And the other group says that you're nuts. What are you going to... You're offering us the chance of having an independent state within the Russian Empire. Yeah. We've already got an independent state within the French Empire. You're offering us something Napoleon's already done for us. Go and jump in the lake. You come back, it's not all, is it? But sooner or later, Alexander was gearing himself up to say, okay, I'm going to attack you. Because I don't trust you sitting in Poland. I don't like this Polish duchy of yours. I don't like this potentially hostile country with a big army sitting on my doorstep. Napoleon tries to convince him, look, the Polish army is huge. I know it is, but I'm using it in Spain. I'm not using it at you. Which is true. I was yeah, we'll see. But it goes on and on like that. And I think, in a way, all he had to do was wait and sit for Alexander to come at him. And then he risked out a very good chance of licking it.
Fighting him on his grounds.
So that he shouldn't have gone in. When he went in, it's easy to say he should have turned back when Alexander kept retreating, but I think it's the exact opposite where we nearly had him, boys. We nearly had him. And they did. We nearly thumped him. Now, look, if we keep at him, we will get him. But the thing to do, I suppose, would have been really, once you get to Moscow, replenish. When you get to, or even Smolness, replenish, say, look, we see how far we pushed him back and get back. And Eylau was it's one of the worst experiences of his military career up to then. Technically, it was a draw, but his army was battered. So he pulled back into Poland, rebuilt, reholed, and went in again in a better campaigning season. He didn't do that in 1812. He was too far into Russia. But those are the two things he might have done differently.
So a year later, the Battle of Leipzig happened. How did the Battle of Leipzig in 1813 mark a significant turning point for Napoleon?
Several important things happened that, taken together, would say, I would think would say that, all right, this isn't necessarily the end for Napoleon. He's not doomed. But from this point onwards, he's got to hope that the Allies make a big mistake. His fate is not entirely in his own hands, whereas before Leipzig it still was, despite Russia. Something important happens beforehand. Very important. The Russians liberated themselves from Napoleon and inflicted a massive cumulative defeat on him, not in one place at one time, but cumulative campaign defeat on him by themselves. They had no significant help from anybody. The British government, for once, is absolutely open with them and doesn't promise things they won't do. They say, look, we're tied up in Spain. You're on your own. When that happens, British Foreign Minister Castlereagh, Foreign Secretary, could go into the Commons, into the government and say, look, Russia is worth investing in. Look what they've done to him. Without anybody's help. They are exhausted. They'll do our fighting for us. All we need to do is give him the money. And he gets his way. And there's obviously the whole lot of horse trading goes on. You know, it'll be a loan, and then in the end, Castlereagh says, just give it to him. That's one thing that comes out of Leipzig. See, they've done it to him again. Just give it to him. The other thing that does then, in the build-up to Leipzig, is Prussia more or less falls to the Russians, and they come in on the side of the Russians. So there's two armies at Dresden a few months before, when Napoleon is beaten by just. It really is a Napoleonic victory in some ways, but not in others. But they're not deterred that Napoleon wins at Dresden. It's such a narrow thing. The British look at that and say, see, they're not giving up. And that convinces them when the Austrians see the aid that the British are actually giving to the Russians and the Prussians, the next big thing is it convinces them to change sides. Because they've been in uneasy alliance with Napoleon. They don't want it, but they feel it. They're compelled. They change sides. They fight at Leipzig. They don't fight terribly well, but they fight. So we now have a coalition of the Big Four. And at Leipzig, it works. It's a horrendous battle that takes 3 days to defeat Napoleon, but he is defeated. He is driven out. And the three armies have fought together. The high commands have held together. And in the meantime, because the Austrians changed sides, Metternich, the Austrian chancellor, who was the foreign minister before then, sees another way. And to me, this is a very big thing that doesn't get talked. The Mittelstadt, as they called in Germany, small states of western and southern Germany, Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, Nassau, the biggest ones, and several others. They had been Napoleon's loyalist allies from the start. They're already on board in 1800 when he comes to power. Metternich turns around and says, look, where we've made mistakes before, as we were saying, we're going to restore things the way they were before Napoleon, which means you're going to lose all the territory that Napoleon gave you. I've convinced everybody to change their minds. Napoleon cannot protect you anymore. Change sides now, and I can. I'll make sure that you keep everything he gave you, but you've got to change sides. You don't have to do very much. You have to change sides. And right at the end of in the course of Leipzig, some those German units desert to the Allies. But when Napoleon comes out of Leipzig, he thinks, okay, there's going to be a fallback position in central Germany. The regroup there. They'll be waiting for them. It'll get easier, boys. Probably would have. But when they all declare war and everything, we got to get out of Germany. And we're going to get out now because our friends are now our enemies. You know, so that's what makes them pull back to France. It's not Allied pressure. He thinks, well, I can absorb another big blow in central Germany because we haven't got far to go. You know, we can regroup, reposition ourselves faster than they can. And I think he was probably right. Now he can't. He has to rush back to France. You know, and those are the things that Leipzig changes. And the confidence it gives to everybody. This time we have clearly beaten him on his own kind of terrain. You know, not in Russia that's out there somewhere that, you know, he was out of his depth. We'd all be out of our depth. You know, who among us, there are a lot of people, sensible people in the Austrian High Command saying, who among us could have done that? No, he was on a loser. He's not on a loser. Look, he won at Dresden, not by much, but he did win. He won with a second-rate army. I'd say, okay, no, we can beat him. You want an armistice to rebuild the army, especially to rebuild the cavalry? He couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. He won 2 small engagements before Dresden, and he won Dresden, and he couldn't pursue us because he didn't have any cavalry. We were waiting for our rear guards to be cut up. For the Prussians to say, oh, we're running off. Didn't happen. Couldn't do it at Leipzig either. Where were they? They weren't anywhere. There weren't enough of them to make a difference. Come on, keep going. Yeah.
Because what happened in between Leipzig and the Exile to Elba? What was Napoleon doing?
Fighting to save France. He has to retreat to France as fast as he can up in Leipzig, and immediately gets back and starts to, again, this conscription system, which is incredibly good, stitching together the best he can, with far inferior numbers to the Allies, but piecing together what he can, getting ready to take him on as best he can. But here, they do something that he's not ready for. There's a big debate in the Allied camp. Tsar Alexander, some of the Russians, and some of the Prussians are saying, let's push on. Let's push on into France. Others, most of the Austrians and some of the Prussians and some of the Russians are saying, look, no, it's the middle of winter. Get nuts. Napoleon? No, we do it. Look, if we get in a minute, he'll be back on his feet and swinging us. We go in now and say home, really before he's ready. But he fights an incredible campaign against them in northeastern France, mainly in the Champagne region, and to a certain extent north of Paris, up in Picardy, up in World War One country. And it's quite a remarkable, tactically. It's a brilliant campaign. I mean, it's one of the campaigns that, so I'm told, the military academies, everybody has to study and everybody has to pass. Don't do that. Yes, you. And all the sort of, again, what we were talking about earlier, being fast. The second guessing your opponent. And it's a bit like American football. The Russians and the Prussians are kind of running interference to protect the Austrians from being slaughtered because they're a very weak army. And so Napoleon's able to pull them wide. He's able to, sort of, like in football, but the fullback running them out wide so the pass won't come in. It goes on like that for weeks until eventually the Prussians catch him at Lone, just north of Paris. And he suffers a bad defeat. He has to fall back. He falls back to Fontainebleau, and at that point it breaks down. The crucial point comes from within. 2 things happen that seal his fate. On the one hand, several of his key marshals come to him and say, look, we can't do long. The men won't fight anymore. And we don't want to fight anymore. We're going to lose everything if we go on like this. We can get a reasonable settlement out of them, but you have no. And so they'll go get lost. Come on, please, I forget it. But then in Paris, something crucial happens. There's enough internal opposition built up to him in the highest quarters. Partly people like Boucher, who tell him, well, they've never liked him, never trusted him. He's never trusted them, but he's stuck with them. But also people who just know the writings on the wall. And above all, don't want Paris to be besieged by the Allied armies and sacked. And particularly telling us a bit over here. Foreign minister, he's been sacked a few years now, but he's still around. He turns to the Senate. And there's just enough majority in the Senate who have been irked by a lot of things Napoleon's been doing, trying to curtail their powers and basically breaking the law over conscription and things like that. frightened enough for their own positions because they know he's fed up with them. And they say there is a clause in the Constitution, and there is, and it's taken directly from ancient Rome. The Republic still exists. The Republic was entrusted to a hereditary emperor, and the Senate has the right to depose that emperor if his continued presence as head of state endangers the Republic and its existence. Senate is right, will depose him. And they form a provisional government around Talleyrand in the Senate. The acid test comes as, will the gendarmerie in Paris support us or him, the police? They come out for the provisional government. And so they turn around and go to the Allies and say, look, what about an armistice? Well, Louis XVIII, who's looking to be restored, is saying, well, you know, we're a provisional government. You don't negotiate with the provisional government. At which point the Tsar and Metternich turn around to him and say, look, you shut up. Yeah, fine, we recognize the provisional government. We'll talk to you. And so the provisional government's able to say, they've accepted an armistice from us. We are the legitimate government of France, not Napoleon. He's been deposed. That means they can say to the army, you are not surrendering. It's a bit like 1918. You are not surrendering. You to stop fighting because there's an armistice. You don't have to surrender to anyone. Napoleon says, no, I'll abdicate, all right. I'll abdicate in favor of my son. I'll accept it. I will abdicate, but it will be my abdication. And I'm telling the army to surrender. And you get these sort of ludicrous things, you know, sort of Soult turning up to Wellington and say, look, I'm surrendering. I brought you my sword. Wellington sort of, oh, you're not supposed to surrender. There's an armistice. So I don't recognize those so-and-sos in Paris. They're traitors. I recognize I'm a soldier of the emperor, so I'm surrendered. Look that thing away. No, just go home, will you? And eventually, though, that's pretty much what happens. Most of the army, they're reluctant. They accept it. The commanders don't want Paris sacked, don't want it besieged. And that's how Napoleon accepts his terms. As Elba's abdication. Among those terms is he'll be exiled to Elba. So he goes.
And what happened to his son after the exile?
It's very sad business. His wife, Marie-Louise, who's the daughter of the Austrian emperor, remains staunchly loyal to Napoleon. She keeps a shadow. She withdraws from Paris to a place called Blois on the Loire, near the reserve army, and with her son. And she's determined to hold out there. But it becomes pretty clear that, you know, the Russians are advancing on her. The only place she'll be safe. Napoleon warns her of this, but he doesn't get the letter. Tells her the same thing she does herself. Turn yourself open to the Austrians. You're the daughter of the emperor. They won't kill you. There's no telling what the Russians will do. The Prussians will do. The Russians have a contract on her. And the Russians said, Alexander says he'll protect you. And he means it, but there'll be some drunken Cossack somewhere who will run you through. So she does eventually turn herself over to the Austrians and her son. They are separated very quickly. By this stage, she is very ill. And they're eventually taken back to Vienna and apart from each other. When Napoleon comes back in 100 days, she's been angling. They're going to make her Duchess of Parma. Afterwards, Parma is where unemployed Habsburgs usually go, historically. Since the 16th century, you're a Habsburg, you need a job, go run Parma, Piacenza. Go run Parma, Piacenza. And it was more or less, yeah, I was expecting that. I've been reading some history books, I expected that. So, fine. That she's been angling, that she goes on actually lobbying for a long time. That don't restore the Bourbons, don't restore the 18th. Make my son Napoleon II. I'll be regent. Go on. And, even her own father says, oh no, you're not getting away with that. No, he'll be on Elba. And if you're reaching, you'll be touchable. Oh, no, I'm not. You might overrule that, but I'm not falling for that. You stay where but she's hopes that she's getting an angle that, all right, I'll go to Parma. But he'll come with me and he'll be Duke apart while I'm dead. When he comes back from Elba for the 100 days, she's already in Parma. All bets are off. No. You are going to stay, you are going to stay separated forever. You're never going to see him again. He's never coming to Parma. He'll stay in Vienna. And it's very, very sad. He grows up to be quite a nice bloke.
Yeah. I made a video about him. It's a very interesting life.
Yeah. It's all very sad, very tragic.
Mm-hmm.
Revolution, he's kept a kind of a prisoner, but not cruelly, in Vienna for most of his life, isn't he? The 1820s, and then revolutions of 1830 in France and in Belgium, actually. There are a lot of cries of, people don't talk, that only means him. Overthrow the Bourbons, bring in Napoleon Charles, bring in Napoleon's son. And from then on, his cars are marked. He sent out pointlessly to review troops in the pouring rain for hours, gets pneumonia, dies. I would say he was the last casualty of the Napoleonic Wars. I'm often said we're always on about plots to poison Napoleon with arsenic in the wallpaper, which is all a load of baloney, if you ask me. There, I think, was a plot to assassinate Napoleon. It's just not Napoleon, Napoleon, Saint Helena. I'd like to see that video. It's just terribly sad story.
Yeah, I'll send it to you via email. Especially like the part where after he died, they were plucking his hair, and they had to put a helmet on him because his hair was all plucked.
Yeah, it's gruesome, isn't it? It's he was a very nice kid.
2 meters tall too.
Yeah, well, that I don't know where they got that from in either side of the family. Have you ever met Charles Bonaparte?
No.
Yeah, he's about 2 meters tall. He's a big guy. Not actually, he's a big guy.
Especially because it's like the Bonaparte complex. It's like the Napoleon complex, like you're a tiny guy, right? And then having the son of Napoleon being 2 meters, probably the tallest guy in Vienna.
Yeah, I mean, some of them were. It means you're almost tall. Joseph wasn't that small. Well, Napoleon actually wasn't small. He was about average height for the time.
Yeah,
he was small. I would say he was about average height for the time, but he was smaller than all the people who were close to him and around him. Smaller than Josephine, smaller than Tsar Alexander. He was smaller than his brothers. He sort of. That's what really matters. He thought of himself as small after a while.
Yeah, because how was his exile in Elba? Like, how did he experience it?
Well, he was bored out of his mind, on the one hand. I think there were two things. He was bored out of his mind, and it's interesting to watch him keep busy. He obviously missed his wife and son terribly. He really did. And when he heard that, there's no way that they'll be allowed to come see you, he was crestfallen. I say he was very bored, and you could tell that in the way he kept busy. Well, but he did the islands a great favor. We'll keep the salt mines working, get the salt mines working again, get the lead mine working again, get a decent fleet built here to defend ourselves from the Barbary corsairs, the Barbary pirates, because they're lurking on it. They're lurking out there, boys. He imposes conscription, which makes him hated, raises taxes, which makes them hated. But he does make the place a going concern. But he's on edge the whole time, because sending him to Elba was a very controversial decision among the Allied leaders. Alexander thought that it was the decent thing to do. And Alexander has the one with the big army, so he gets his way. The British and the Austrians are dead against it. And Alexander just, all right, well, you're in charge. The Italian, the Italian coast is on the hands of the Austrians. They will police that. The Royal Navy has bases all over the Med. It will patrol it, and you will make sure that this doesn't happen. Louis XVIII is saying, I don't think this is a good idea. But there's also a deeper feeling that we can't be harsh to it. One of our reasons for hating the French revolutionaries so much is they went around guillotining nobles, and they went around, we're not sinking to that level. We're not going to be seen as barbarous people. So we're going to be decent to him. There is I think it might be apocryphal, but there's no documentation for it. But when Castlereagh says, you see, we have this island in the South Pacific. I've got it from the Navy charts, Saint Helena. And Metternich says, what's Saint Helena? Where's Saint Helena? Castlereagh says to him, my point exactly, friend. I'm with you. Now that sounds good to me. Wellington has this idea that, and he raises it again after Waterloo. Why can't we just send him up to Scotland and give him a estate in the Highlands of Scotland? Mm. He might die of cold or something, but at least, he can be a laird or something now. I mean, Napoleon suggests, why can't I go to Ireland and live with Wellington in his estate? No way, there's nowhere you go to Ireland. No way. But Napoleon's seriously sitting there thinking, they could change their minds and send me to Saint Helena. I've got my globe of the world with me. It's not the only thing he managed to take with him to Elba. I found Saint Helena. I'm not living there. I've got no choice but to make a run for it. If I don't make a run for it and try and grab power back in Paris, they'll exile me anyway. So I may as well take a chance.
And how carefully planned was his comeback from Elba to Paris?
The escape itself was meticulously planned. He gets his British minder, Campbell, out of the way. Campbell's a bit dim. He convinces Campbell that his mistress, who is in Florence, is having an affair with a guy in Florence. He says he knows it through his intelligence service. He waits for him to go off, to be out of the island. He times it perfectly, because he has his own little navy. He uses a couple of his own ships, and he manages to hire, through an intermediary in France, a couple of smaller ships from Marseille. He get his little army over about 500 men, but it takes a few ships to do that, small ships to do that.
But where did he get the money from to even hire these people?
Oh, well, he's got his contacts in France. There is still a whole network of pro-Napoleon people there who can finance it for him. He's got people, you see, the restored French government and the Allies had been very laid back about all this. Napoleon's, Josephine's daughter, his stepdaughter, Hortense, is still living in Paris. She was Louis, King of Holland's wife, Mm-hmm. She's still, she's a diehard loyalist. She's living in Paris. Somebody else, his brother Joseph's wife, she's still living in Paris. There's a sister of Napoleon's old girlfriend, Desiree Clary, who's now the Queen of Sweden, married to one of his large. She's still living in Paris. A lot of his former, the guy who succeeds Boucher as chief of police, Savary, he's still kicking around Paris. They've got they get together. They get together for tea a couple of times a week, and there's still a whole bit of people who have been sacked by the Bourbons and who were in the police, because the police were notoriously pro-Napoleon, notoriously left-wing and Jacobin. They're still around and have their contacts. That side of it works perfectly for him.
Okay.
What doesn't work is because he has to land in Provence and make his way up north through Provence, which is incredibly always been a region hostile to Napoleon, hostile to the revolution, pro-royalist, very Catholic. And he's got to navigate that. That's the real challenge. But the whole thing's meticulously planned.
Because one of the moments that's also shown in the Napoleon movie, the older one, not the newest one, is during the 100-day return, he meets like old soldiers, right? And they point the gun at him, and he's like, "You will shoot the emperor," something like that. Is that a true story?
Yeah, when he's getting close to, he's staying right out of the way at the beginning. He knows that there are troops being mobilized against him here and there, and local national guards, and they'll be loyal to Louis. They'll be loyal to the Bourbons because it's that sort of region. So he honestly, if you go the route Napoleon from the coast up to Grenoble, don't do it, mate. They're hairpin dens. You're practically on goat paths. I mean, it's nerve-wracking. It really is. And when he gets to Grenoble, that's the first big garrison town. And he knows that this is make or break. If the Grenoble garrison stand against me, then it's all up. If they come over to me, and they send party out then from Grenoble to as much to test the waters as to capture him, and they're arrayed in their own front of him, and he turns up. And it's exactly as the myth says. He just toughs it out. You all know me. I'm your emperor. Well, shoot me? Go ahead, shoot me. Do you want to join me? Come on, you're the veterans. You've been here before. There's been some interesting new research done on the composition of that unit that went out to stop him. And it appears that they weren't all Napoleonic veterans. Some were, just enough. A lot of them were raw recruits. And they would sort of do what the officers and the NCOs told them, and they would be loyalists, but they're not. The guy who did the research said, I'm not sure about the rank and file, how well they were, but they were carried along. You know, they were. Oh, it's a true story. There were a couple of eyewitness accounts by guys who were just passing by. And so this was at the time they wrote it down, not with benefit of hindsight to make money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they come over to him and the Grenoble garrison. Yeah, a lot of them flee. They stay loyal initially and flee, but most of them stay loyal to him, and that's the real start.
And how easy was it for Napoleon to come back to Paris? Was there like a lot of, well, battles against Napoleon from like the loyalists, or not at all?
There was no significant resistance after he takes Grenoble. It's a triumphal march. But you got to remember, after Grenoble, he's coming up into the Franche-Comté, Burgundy, Champagne, regions that have always been pro-revolutionary from the beginning and always pro-Napoleon. You know, so he's just as in Provence, in the southern half of his trip, the first half of his trip, he's in dangerous country where if he tried to confront them, he'd have lost, probably killed, into his heartland, where he knows he's with his own, he's got his own supporters with him. You know, make France great again, and they pour out to him. You know, the church bells are ringing, everyone turns out for him. It's a triumphal march. I mean, it's in Lyon, it's embarrassing, second biggest city in France. And, you know, the king's brother, who will be the future Charles X, the Comte d'Artois, I mean, he goes down there, and one of Napoleon's marshals is there. He says, I'm taking command of this place. We're going to make a stand, boys, aren't we? No. And he literally has to escape out one gate while Napoleon's arriving in the other.
Wow.
He's running. I mean, he's wearing horses out left, right, and center. They're all on the run, and people are coming over to him. And he just roller coasters in with no opposition at all. Which really is why Louis XVIII packs up and says, look, I'm not, it'll be a bloodbath for no reason, fellas. I mean, I've got no support here. I'm going over the border to Belgium. There is a France out there that won't support him, but it isn't here. You know, so it's a triumphal march.
And what are the first few things that Napoleon does as soon as he becomes emperor again?
Well, first of all, he tells everybody I'm emperor. You know, he tells all the local administration, right, you're loyal to me. And he appoints the cabinet. You know, he appoints the government. He has trouble getting some of them to play ball with him. Some do, some don't. Some do so very reluctantly. A lot of people are not because they dislike him or they're disloyal, but they're thinking, look, this isn't going to last. This is mad. But a lot of them come around and serve it anyway. But he's trying to piece together a government. Above all, he's going to raise an army. He sends the word out to the local administration, to the prefects, to the local commanders. Start. One of the things that's helped him is that the Bourbons, when they were restored, abolished conscription in a big effort to make themselves popular, which they did. But they couldn't actually stop the conscription process going ahead in 1814. So there are still recruits in the depots who can be mobilized. And a lot of them are. A lot of veterans come out. It's not a great army that he puts together. It's very small in number for what it has to do. But that's what he's mainly preoccupied with. A revolt breaks out in the west of France in the Vendée, which has always been revolting against the revolution and sometimes Napoleon. A revolt breaks out there. It's on a fairly small scale, but he has to mobilize troops to try and contain it. And really holds his breath. He's desperately trying to get foreign recognition. But the trouble is that most of the ambassadors to other countries, all of them, in fact, have been appointed now by Louis XVIII. Napoleon's staff are gone. And only the United States recognizes, because they're at war with Britain anyway.
But the United States recognizes Napoleon.
Yeah, it would, because the United States is at war with Britain. The War of 1812 is still raging. So, yeah, they recognize Napoleon. Oh, yeah. But no, nobody else.
I completely forgot about that part, about that during Waterloo, Britain was also in war with America then. So that makes it even, because how strong would you say was Britain during Waterloo in comparison to other battles before that with Napoleon?
Well, the only significant fighting the British ever did was in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And but what emerges from the Peninsula War is a very professional, very well-led, very battle-hardened army that's come out of Spain. And a lot of them are getting ready to be shipped to America, but they haven't gone yet. Some have, and later will, after Waterloo. But a lot of them are coming back to England in the not perhaps having been demobilized yet. Some of them maybe have, but not for long. So. But the British, this all gets very complicated, because after the 1814 campaign, once Napoleon's defeated, in Exile to Elba, the Allies become very suspicious of each other. When Napoleon gets back, the first thing he decides to do, because everyone declared war on him, and this is where the whole thing is doomed, says, right, the British, the Anglo-Dutch army, because we should call it that, because really a lot of the troops in Waterloo were Dutch, the Anglo-Dutch army and the Prussians are up there. So that's where I'll go and I'll take them on. And if I defeat them, they'll back off. And then the Austrians will back off. What he doesn't want to think about is that Alexander is sitting in eastern France with a massive Russian army, close to 200,000 strong. By now, the best army in the world. The best soldiers in the world. Equipped by the British. And so I was going to say earlier, if you were looking for a tipping point in the whole thing, it's when the British decided to back the Russians to give them money. Anyways, and there they are, supplied and paid for by the British, sitting there in France. Alexander just folds his arms. Okay. He wants to go up there, take the British and the Prussians, and all that. The British and the Prussians do the fighting. British can fight for once. We'll sit here, boys. We've done enough. Then we'll move in. And so, so the British presence is strong at Waterloo, but it can't be anywhere else to do anything else. The Prussians have committed an awful lot to it too. The ace up the sleeve is Russia. It's the Russian army, which doesn't fire a shot. It's the strongest military power on the ground.
So how many soldiers was Napoleon able to recruit?
I mean, off the top of my head, I should know these things off the top of my head. Not enough. It's about right. He's got roughly sort of 85,000 men. But it's almost all he has. There are National Guard units, scattered around the country, particularly in Paris. There's the troops he's got in the Vendée, who are all very good troops, but not large in number. He's got token forces along the eastern frontier, but nothing that could put up serious resistance on their own. This is the thing to remember about it. He's thrown everything he has where he's got rough parity with the British and the Prussians put together. That's all he has. The Prussians are rushing in reinforcements in their own territories from northern Germany all the time. They get reinforcements. When Napoleon beats them in the first engagement above, it doesn't matter because the Prussians are rushing more reinforcements on. They're more on the way by the time Blucher gets to Waterloo. They don't fight, but they're on their way. Some units do get there in time to fight. Again, Wellington is jumping up and down. I want my Peninsula veterans, and I want them here. And all right, they'll be on the way. Alexander has his big army sitting there and said, you know what? A lot of my troops were transported here, courtesy of the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy can pick up another Russian army on the Baltic and on the North Sea coast, put them in Royal Navy ships, and have them on the Channel coast. And the British and the Russians, we can all go together. We can attack from two fronts if we want to. Let's just wait it out. They had all that in reserve. Even without the British and the Prussians bringing in more men, they had about 200,000 Russians sitting there and more on the way if needed. But Napoleon has thrown everything into war. He's got no significant reserves. A few, but not enough to hold back the whole tide.
Are there any historians who argue that Napoleon had a chance?
Not among the current generation. I don't know of anyone offhand who'd have said that Napoleon, he had a chance. Look, he had a chance of winning the battle. And the battle was what Wellington said. It was a damn near on thing. He had a chance of winning the battle. He may well have beaten Wellington, but then the Prussians would have arrived straight away. He'd beaten the Prussians at Val. And there was still a darn good chance he would have beaten Napoleon on Wellington on the field at Waterloo, except he handled it so bad. And Blucher got there in time. But what would have happened afterwards was a foregone conclusion, I think, by any rational estimation. Prussian reinforcements were turned up. He'd have had to fight again. There was a huge loss of officers, huge loss of non-commissioned officers. It would have been very difficult to patch that army together to confront an organized army in the field. May have been able to deal with the Prussian reinforcements, maybe not. The Russians would have cut them to pieces. They wouldn't have had a chance. They wouldn't.
And how well did Napoleon fight in Waterloo?
He was obviously quite ill during the battle, as he had been during Borodino and several other occasions. He didn't really know what was going on over a lot of the field. There's a whole army corps nearby on the left-hand side of the road that divides the main field at Waterloo that is not used until the very end, which I find remarkable. He did an awful lot wrong. I mean, the weather, the mud, slowed him down. Wellington had time to dig in so that Napoleon's artillery, which was still formidable, couldn't do its job properly. He had no real control of what was going on. He didn't trust Ney, who was the only commander in the field. He had the wrong commanders in the field. He left Dabo in Paris. It's a rational decision to leave Dabo in control of something that's pretty volatile. But even so, he had his two best field commanders, Dabo and Soult. He left Dabo in Paris. He brought Soult, but he picked out a position. He made him chief of staff. Because Berthier wasn't there. Berthier was dead by then. And didn't rally to Napoleon anyway. Soult had faced Wellington many times. Wellington was a little afraid of Soult. Soult was a little afraid of Wellington, but they knew each other's game. Soult was a great commander. Napoleon made him chief of staff, and he had no idea. He had no idea how to be chief of staff, so the communications were terrible all over the field. He had no idea what to do. None. But he was there, but he had his two best field marshals, and he did not use them in the field. The only senior commander he had available to him at Waterloo was Ney. Now, I think Ney's a bit maligned at Waterloo, but he still was Ney, and Napoleon didn't quite trust him. And that only made things worse, too. And neither did Soult having served with Ney in Spain. And that didn't help anything at the top. But, I mean, they still did remarkably well. They still fought remarkably well. Well, I mean, Wellington, was saying, look, I'm running out of options here. I'm hemmed in. I mean, if the Prussians don't turn up soon, I don't know what I'm going to do. The Prussians turn up, okay, boys, we know what we're going to do. He had enough left in him to counterattack because he worn the French down. Or he couldn't have kept doing that much longer.
Do you think Napoleon was also less confident during that battle in comparison to back in the day?
That's hard to say. It is hard to fathom him in the 100-day period in some ways. I think he kind of focused on what was in front of him and he didn't think about the bigger picture. He had beaten Blucher at Wavre. He had beaten the Prussians. So that does make him confident that I can take on the Anglo-Dutch. They're not good soldiers. He's got a blind spot. The English can't fight. You're sort of saying, I tell you, I've been in Spain. I know. You're wrong, boss. Come on, don't be silly. We can take them on. All right, they might be as bad as I say they are, but we're better than them. We're better than them. And he was almost right. He'd had beaten the Prussians at Wavre, but he didn't realize what the Prussians had fallen back and regrouped and been reinforced. Beating the Prussians, let's head for the British and Dutch now. And he wasn't thinking about the big picture. Let's just beat them and see what happens next. There would be no next. But he had to be confident about the next game. But he couldn't be confident about the whole campaign.
Did he try to sue for peace?
Well, on impossible terms. I mean, he said, recognize me and give France its pre-empire borders. Recognize my son's right to see, let my wife and son come home. I don't want to rebuild the empire. I want France back as France was. I want my family back. And what's up? Thinking too that, well, the Austrians don't really want to fight. They didn't. They're not doing anything here. Alexander will get fed up with all this. I know Alexander. And he's right about some things. It's never entirely stupid. Alexander does not like the Bourbons. He doesn't like Louis XVIII. He thinks they're a bunch of losers. But he's put up with their restoration. Now he sees how precarious their position is. My position might be precarious, but so is theirs. Why is Louis and his court in Belgium now in Ghent? You'll think about this. But Alexander is thinking, he's thinking, I'm not thinking I'm going to let Napoleon back in power. I am thinking that maybe we can do this without worlds. Doesn't get away with that. If the British are defeated and the Prussians are defeated at war, they'll just say, right, okay, we've had enough. Okay. That's what he's gambling. Beat them and they'll give up. Of course, it's not good like that. But I think he genuinely felt, to come back to what I said earlier, really, he just didn't have an viable alternative for himself. They're going to send me to Saint Helena anyway. Well, they can try. We'll see what happens. It's worth taking a chance, because I literally now have nothing to lose. Millions of other Frenchmen did, but he's not thinking like that. But he's also thinking to himself, the Bourbons are not liked in France. Look how easy it was for me. Now, yes and no. There's an element in France that is loyal to him. That's loyal to the revolution, even maybe more to him, who worries about what the Bourbons are going to do. But there's another element, and I think this is the vast majority of the population, is we do not want him back with his conscription and his taxation and his war. We'll put up with the Bourbons.
Why didn't Napoleon just try to escape to like a different country, to like America or something?
Now, this is interesting. What happens after Waterloo is very interesting. He gets back to Paris, and at first he's for standing and fighting in Paris. There's one army corps under Grouchy that managed to escape being mangled, Waterloo. And Soult and Jerome, his younger brother, do a brilliant job of patching together what's left of the army after Waterloo, getting it back to Paris in one piece, fighting rearguard actions all the while. David's the commandant in Paris and says, look, I can mobilize the Paris National Guard. They're loyal. Now, with what's left of the army and them, we can dig in here. And the Allies will think twice about taking us on, which they did. Wellington's fought a lot of sieges in Spain, and he doesn't want to fight another. Blucher doesn't care. But Napoleon and Alexander we don't want to do this if we can help it. But then it becomes clear that Napoleon's parliament has turned on him. They want rid of him. That, Alexander said, just going to move in with the Russian army. A siege just to starve us out. And even then, even loyalists like Davout turn around and say, look, you gotta go. And one of the things that swings it is he cuts a deal with the royalist agents and with what's now a new provincial government of Paris, thinking, give me a false passport, a Bourbon government passport, and let me get to the border. Fine. But you have to go under escort. You're going as a prisoner, effectively. Escort. So it's, you better accept that. Because he's at his country house at Malmaison. By then, he's left Paris, and the Prussians have a contract out on you. Blucher is ignoring Alexander. He's ignoring Wellington. He's got Prussian cavalry out looking for you, and they're going to kill you. Gotta go. So he and his brother Joseph decide, right, okay, let's take the Allied offer. Let's take the passports. Go. They have to go through dangerous country through the western France, but his troops there are still well doing. They can get him through the Vendée rebel country, heading to the southwest. Now, the story is complicated. The story keeps changing. First of all, we'll let you go to a major port, Nantes. There'll be a ship there. You can sort something out, probably America. Then it keeps changing. Bordeaux. No, you're not going to Bordeaux. And you take it to a tiny little port, right down in the south, north of Bordeaux, but in a very remote corner of the west coast, where anything could happen. Now, there are a couple of ships, but not far away. He says to Joseph, one of them's going to America. You go, you wait for me. Joseph goes, the ship sails anyway, Joseph gets to America. What changed Napoleon's mind not to go with Joseph? I don't know. But that's when he decides, all right, I'll go to Austria, I'll throw myself on the mercy of the British and hope that they'll be decent to me. And they take him to Britain, but there was a chance for him to escape to America. Maybe. Doesn't do it. One of the reasons I think he chose not to was that he might have endangered Joseph. Because they're traveling under assumed names. Right? And they could turn up together, somebody might recognize Napoleon, but if Joseph goes their own, nobody's going to recognize him. Well, it'd be very unlucky if anybody did. And right enough, Joseph gets safely to America. Lucien travels separately through the Channel ports, so he gets to America too. But there was a chance he could have got to the States. He chose not to take that chance. Possibly to protect Joseph. He turns himself over to the British. He says, here I am. Now I'm depending on your sense of decency. What are you going to do with me? And he goes, well, when he gets to Britain, when he gets to Plymouth, when he gets to various ports, the southern coast, it's, the crowds turned out to greet him one thing or another. Celebrity, let's have a look at him. But the British would have made up, no, this time you're going to Saint Helena. And they stand on it. He is our prisoner. They say to Alexander, no, you're a prisoner. He's our prisoner. And he's going to Saint Helena. And no one's going to, then, they're all sitting there, the Prussian ambassador, the Prussian foreign minister sort of sitting there, Metternich sort of sitting there, saying, Alexander, you expect us to back you up? I have no intention of trying to protect him. This time goes. There was a chance he could have got to America, to the United States. There was a chance. And they would have protected him because they're still at war with Britain. They would have taken him in.
Because the two brothers of Napoleon, how was their life in America? Did they live a decent life?
Oh, yeah, they had a great time. Joseph particularly. Joseph became a sort of a gentleman farmer in New Jersey, around about the Princeton, Trenton area, and in Philadelphia. And he made quite a lot of money. And he became a great benefactor of the opera in Philadelphia, a great benefactor of the American Philosophical Society. He eventually decided to come back to Europe, the revolutions of 1830, because there were stirrings. And I think he got, his ambition got the better of him. Came back and he died of a seizure. That's what we call a stroke nowadays in Genoa on his way back. Again, Lucien lived out a pretty good existence in the States. He eventually went to Rome because this is one of the odd things about Napoleon. There was very little personal animus towards him when you knew him personally, although there was a lot of political animus. And the Pope, Pius VII, who Napoleon is imprisoned at one point, said about the family, oh, they can come and live in Rome. So Napoleon's mum settles in Rome, his mother. And that's fine. And they wouldn't let the sisters join her. They wouldn't let them come. But Jerome, the youngest Bonaparte, he came to Rome. And Lucien came back from the States to Rome, lived out his life there. And it, again, did quite well. He was a sort of a journalist, a review. He was a reviewer. He was a critic. An art critic, theater critic, that kind of thing. Was well thought of in literary circles. Jerome, the youngest brother, much maligned by Napoleon, and he married the daughter of the ruler Baden, and she stayed loyal to him. He was never allowed to go back there. They wouldn't have him. But he lived in Rome. Lived long enough to see his nephew Napoleon III become emperor. And in the early years, he was an older man by then, in the early years of the Second Empire, played quite an influential role behind the scenes. Never took an active role in politics, but he was there. He was an advisor, very much a private advisor, a good one too, sensible man. And that's what happened to them.
The brothers. Because I can imagine the amount of wealth they used to have, like back in France. Do you think they brought any of that back to America? Or did they like start all over again back in the States?
Oh, they started all over again, and they did well. But in fact, Caroline and Murat, their two sons, made their way to America. Their children made their way to America. Not quite sure how. I do know, I can't remember. But they were allowed to eventually to go. And they did well for themselves. They settled in Tallahassee in Florida and became very prominent. And two of the grandsons fought as cavalry commanders in the Confederate Army in the Civil War.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they all have the big sort of Southern Gothic type tombs in this big sort of, in the cemetery in Tallahassee. There's a Murat Motel as well.
This is a bit of a random question, but did any of like the founding fathers meet any of the Bonapartes?
Not that I'm aware. Not that I'm aware. That's an interesting question. I don't know. I've never followed that trail too closely. Other people have. Other people have. Thierry Lance has written fairly recently a very good life of Jerome, of Joseph. There's a good life of Jerome out a few years ago by Jacques-Olivier Boudon. I'm not sure that he didn't get to the stage. Lucien, there's a new life of Lucien out. Just I think last year. I haven't read it yet.
Okay, that would be interesting though if they did. That would be really like.
No, I don't think so. But they were very prominent people around the Philadelphia area.
I can imagine like they're little celebrities too, because I mean everyone kind of knew what was happening back in Europe.
Napoleon was hugely popular in America. Hugely popular at the time. Especially the different images of him. He was the little guy standing up to the big monarchs of Europe, despite the fact he was a pretty much absolutist monarch himself. But it's fascinating. But he had a huge image in America from the start as this little guy standing up to them. Yeah.
Because I can, because I think I've read like a couple times, like even like Benjamin Franklin and stuff, like they really like researched Napoleon's life.
No, I've never come across that.
Okay. Well, what was it like for Napoleon then, his final days in Saint Helena? Did he keep himself busy doing hobbies or whatever?
Wasn't allowed to. I mean, they were miserable. Well, I mean, his health, he was in bad shape, health-wise. I mean, he was in bad shape anyway during the 100 days. I mean, he was even worse shape when he got sick and all it. He was really a prisoner by then. Nobody trusted him. He was on lockdown. He was a prisoner. He wasn't too bad when he lived down by the coast. But the British soon moved him up to a place called Longwood House, which is the unhealthiest part of the island. Time that they're terrible, his health began to decline. He had precious little to do. He dictated his memoirs to 4 different people and that sort of thing. He wasn't allowed to correspond with anyone. There's no correspondence for that time.
Could be hard for him because I do know that he's written like thousands of letters. You could say like he was nearly like an addict of writing letters.
If he'd been allowed to write letters on Saint Helena, I'd have another 4 volumes of correspondence to wade through. But he didn't. There's a few collections of letters he sort of tried to smuggle out, but that were intercepted. But, there's nothing. I mean, he knew after a while this was a hopeless exercise, as he wasn't well.
Did he read a lot during those days in Saint Helena?
Yes, he did. What he had, he didn't have much of a library to refer to. He was a voracious reader all his life.
Yeah.
He didn't have much with him.
But in Elba he did, right?
Yeah, a fair amount on Elba. And he could ask to sort of people, could you go, Are you going over to France? Are you going over to Italy? Well, could you get me? And people would. People would. But on Saint Helena, I mean, he wasn't allowed to correspond with anyone. He wasn't allowed to receive mail, anything. And he soon ran out of, books. So it was pretty miserable.
Seems really miserable. It's a sad ending for such a glorious life, you could say.
Oh yeah, it's you couldn't make it up.
Mm-hmm. To wrap up this conversation, what do you think is one of the key leadership lessons that, or no, let's say, what is one of the mistakes that Napoleon's made where future leaders could learn from?
Oh, I think most of all, to be more reasonable and realistic in your diplomatic negotiations. And I think this would take us right back to the Russian campaign. If you want to make somebody your friend and your ally, don't invade their country. And something like the Continental Blockade is a perfect example of imperial overstretch. Don't take on something you know you can't do. It was impossible to control the European coast to the extent he did. You can't do that. I can encapsulate for you. You always said several points. It was the British are going to have to talk. And the British are going to want something for them. But I can't just walk over them. But if you didn't know how to make them believe that, no one would trust him. So he resorted to force. And I think that's a huge failing in some. I think that's the crucial thing. As he took on, this happens a lot in life, in political life. Britain and Russia were two superpowers. They had their flaws. Britain could never take him on land and hope to win. They could make trouble for him in Spain, but they could never defeat him. They weren't a land power, but they were stinking rich. Russia had huge resources, material resources, resources of manpower, but an underdeveloped economy. All Russia needed was the money pumped in to its armaments industry, to its economy, to raise an army, to equip an army. And when, in 1813, British decided that Russia was worth investing in, British gold reunited to Russian resources, he was a goner. Unless they themselves made a mistake, which they did not. He didn't assess what he could have been taking on. He didn't think about that. He didn't really think hard enough about the big opposition to him and what might happen.